Imagine you're a 12-year-old girl in medieval France, and today is your wedding day. You've never met your husband, a 40-year-old lord who bought you from your father like an animal. As you stand at the altar in your white dress, you notice the crowd gathering isn't just here for the ceremony. They're staying for the show afterward, when they'll watch your husband prove he owns your body right in front of them. This wasn't some rare horror. This was marriage in the Middle Ages. You think you know medieval times, the knights, the castles, the dreamy stories of love. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Marriage was a legal way to torture kids, turn them into property, make bedrooms into crime scenes, and wedding nights into public displays of cruelty. For over 1,000 years, Europe ran the most organized system of spousal slavery ever seen. What I'm about to show you will make you thankful for every freedom you have today. Because the awful truth of medieval marriage makes modern relationship troubles seem like child's play. Between 500 and 1500 CE across medieval Europe, marriage wasn't about love, friendship, or even choice. It was a business deal where daughters were traded, wives were possessions, and children were profit. The Catholic Church, lords and laws all worked together to treat women like breeding animals. Marriage was just legal ownership. Medieval society believed women were flawed, weak, and worthless. They couldn't own land, couldn't make legal choices, and couldn't even pick their own husbands. From the second a girl was born, her whole life was about prepping her body and dowry for a male owner. The proof is in church records, legal papers, doctor's notes, and private letters that expose the real terror of medieval marriage. Court cases show abuse that wasn't just allowed, it was protected by law. Doctors wrote guides on how to prepare child brides for grown men. Diaries reveal the mental pain women endured from girlhood to death. Marriage contracts from then read like farm animal sales, listing the bride's body, baby-making potential, and price. Girls were checked like cattle teeth, looked at, fertility judged, and virginity tested before sale. The younger the bride, the more she cost, because child wives were easier to control and less likely to fight back. This wasn't just personal suffering. Medieval marriage was a system of legal abuse that shaped Europe for 1,000 years. But the human pain was just the start. The biggest discovery about medieval marriage didn't come from digging up ruins. It came from fixing the floor at Canterbury Cathedral in night. Workers lifting old stones found a hidden room with belongings of medieval wives, including papers the church had buried for 500. Inside were marriage contracts with directions for breaking in, child brides' tools for wedding night checks, and worst of all, the secret diary of a priest who blessed these weddings. Father Thomas of Canterbury's private journal, written between 1340 and 1360, told of his growing disgust at what he had to watch and approve in God's name. The priest wrote of weddings where 8-year-old brides were married to men old enough to be their grandfather. He wrote about blessing unions where the child bride had to be carried to the altar because she was too young to walk in an adult wedding dress. Most disturbing were his accounts of the bedding ceremonies, where he was required to bless the marriage bed before the public consummation that would follow. But Father Thomas's most shocking revelation was the systematic nature of child abuse in medieval marriage. This wasn't an occasional aberration, but standard practice across all social classes. Wealthy merchants bought child brides to secure business alliances. Noble families traded daughters like chess pieces to build political power. Even peasant families sold their youngest daughters to older men who could provide economic security. The medical evidence was equally disturbing. Skeletal remains from medieval graveyards show that many young wives died from internal injuries consistent with sexual trauma. Others died in childbirth, their adolescent bodies unable to survive pregnancies that began before they had finished growing. The mortality rate among teenage wives was staggering, but the system continued because replacement brides were always available. When Canterbury officials discovered Father Thomas's journal, they immediately classified it as sensitive historical material and restricted access to approved scholars only. The public would never learn about the systematic abuse that the medieval church had not just tolerated, but actively facilitated for centuries. Medieval marriage operated through a hierarchy of ownership that determined every aspect of a woman's existence. At the top were kings and nobles who could claim any woman in their territory through the right of prima nocta. Below them, wealthy merchants and landowners competed to buy the youngest and most beautiful brides available. At the bottom were peasant girls who were sold to whoever could afford their modest bride price. The marriage market began early, with girls as young as 6 years old being formally betrothed to secure future alliances. Margaret Beaufort, mother of the future Henry VIII, was married at age 6 to John d'Ala, then remarried at age 9 when her first husband died. By age 13, she had been married 3 times and was pregnant with her first child. Her experience wasn't exceptional. It was the standard path for noble girls throughout medieval Europe. The preparation for marriage was comprehensive and brutal. Girls learned that their bodies belonged to their future husbands, that resistance was sinful, and that their only value lay in their ability to produce male heir. They were taught specific techniques for enduring pain, methods for hiding emotional distress, and ways to please men who might be decades older than themselves. Medical texts from the period describe the physical toll this system took on young bodies. Girls who were married before puberty often suffered permanent damage from premature sexual activity. Those who survived to bear children faced complications that frequently proved fatal. Medieval physicians developed an entire specialty around treating the injuries that resulted from child marriage, but their focus was on keeping girls alive long enough to produce heirs, not on preventing the abuse that caused the injuries. The psychological impact was devastating. Letters from medieval wives describe symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma: dissociation during sexual encounters, chronic anxiety about pregnancy, and an inability to form emotional attachments even to their own children. Many developed what contemporary sources called melancholia, withdrawing from social contact and spending their days in prayer or silent contemplation. Perhaps most disturbing was how this abuse was justified through religious doctrine. Church leaders taught that God had created women specifically to serve men, that suffering in marriage was divinely ordained, and that resistance to husbands was equivalent to rebellion against God himself. Marriage wasn't just a legal contract, it was a religious sacrament that sanctified systematic abuse as holy duty. But this systematic abuse was nothing compared to what happened on medieval wedding nights, when private torture became public entertainment. What I'm about to describe will make everything you just heard seem like a children's story. We're talking about ceremonies where entire communities gathered to witness the destruction of childhood innocence, where virginity was verified through medieval medical procedures, and where failure to bleed meant accusations of witchcraft or adultery. Before we dive into the most disturbing part, subscribe and hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next, and definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same curiosity about the darkest parts of human history. The next practice transformed wedding nights into public spectacles of abuse that would be considered torture by modern standards. The medieval bedding ceremony represented the absolute pinnacle of institutionalized sexual abuse, transforming what should have been private, intimate moments into public displays of ownership and control. These weren't just wedding traditions. They were ritualized torture sessions designed to break young wives psychologically while entertaining the community that had bought and sold them. The ceremony began with the public undressing of the bride, performed by the groom's female relatives, who would examine her body for defects, diseases, or signs of previous sexual activity. The bride, often still a child, would be stripped naked in front of crowds that could include dozens of family members, friends, and even strangers who had paid to witness the spectacle. Any physical imperfection could result in the marriage being annulled, and the bride returned to her family in disgrace. Medieval legal documents describe the detailed examinations that preceded consummation. Midwives would publicly verify the bride's virginity through invasive procedures that were essentially medical rape, performed for the entertainment of wedding guests. The bride's reactions to this violation were carefully observed, with crying or resistance interpreted as evidence of previous sexual experience, enough to void the marriage contract. The actual bedding ceremony, took place in a specially prepared chamber, surrounded by witnesses who would remain throughout the consummation to verify its completion. The groom would demonstrate his ownership of his new property while family members offered encouragement and advice. Young brides, many of whom had no understanding of what was happening to them, would experience their first sexual encounter as a public performance, watched by their own relatives. The morning after brought another round of public humiliation. The blood-stained sheets were displayed to prove the bride's virginity and the marriage's completion. Insufficient blood could result in accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or fraud. Medieval medical texts describe procedures for creating artificial bleeding when natural evidence was inadequate, including the insertion of sharp objects or animal blood to satisfy community expectations. Isabella of Valois experienced one of the most documented bedding ceremonies in medieval history when she married Richard II of England at age 6. Contemporary accounts describe how the child bride was so small that adult wedding garments had to be altered to fit her tiny frame. The wedding night was postponed for years due to her age, but she was still required to undergo public examination and sleep in the marriage bed with her adult husband to establish legal ownership. The psychological trauma inflicted during these ceremonies was intentional and systematic. Medieval authorities understood that breaking a wife's spirit early would ensure lifelong compliance. Young women who resisted or showed independent thinking were subjected to increasingly severe bedding rituals designed to eliminate any trace of personal autonomy. Foreign visitors to medieval Europe were often shocked by the brutality of bedding ceremony. A 13th-century Islamic diplomat wrote that European marriage customs resembled slave markets more than religious celebrations, noting that the public humiliation of brides exceeded anything he had witnessed in societies Europeans considered barbaric. The economic dimension added another layer of horror. Wealthy families invited paying spectators to bedding ceremonies, turning their daughters' sexual trauma into entertainment revenue. The more brutal the ceremony, the higher the admission price. Some nobles became infamous for hosting elaborate spectacles that drew crowds from across their regions. The aftermath was often as traumatic as the event itself. Brides who failed to satisfy expectations faced punishments like beatings, confinement, or disgraceful return to their family. Many developed wedding sickness, a condition marked by refusal to eat, speak, or interact with others. This wasn't aberrant behavior by individual sadists, but institutionalized torture supported by legal, religious, and social authorities. Every level of medieval society participated in and profited from the systematic abuse of young women disguised as tradition. The ultimate horror wasn't just the initial trauma but the lifelong cycle of abuse that followed. For women who survived their wedding nights, marriage became a slow death sentence. Forced pregnancies, legalized domestic violence, and economic dependency made escape impossible. Pregnancy in medieval times was Russian roulette with fatal odds. Medical records show 1 in 3 women died in childbirth, rates even higher among teenage brides. Yet the system demanded continuous pregnancies to produce male heirs, forcing survivors to gamble repeatedly. Medieval medicine worsened the dangers. Bloodletting during labor, believed to expel evil spirits, left women too weak to survive delivery. Birthing chairs prioritized spectacle over safety. Unsanitary instruments and untrained attendants caused fatal infections. The legal framework sealed women's fate. Coverture laws erased a wife's legal personhood, making her her husband's property. The rule of thumb permitted beatings with sticks no thicker than a thumb. Husbands could legally murder wives for adultery, witchcraft, or treason, terms they defined arbitrarily. Economic traps prevented escape. Marriage contracts transferred all property and earnings to husbands. Women who fled faced starvation or forcible return by authority. The psychological destruction was methodical. Letters reveal women who stopped using their own names, referring to themselves only as his wife or their mother. For most, death was the only escape, and mortality rates reflected that grim truth. Most women died by age 30, worn out by repeated pregnancies, domestic violence, and the accumulated trauma of years of systematic abuse. Those who survived to become widows faced immediate pressure to remarry, as unmarried women were considered dangerous to the social order. The few women who lived to old age often suffered from what medieval sources called marriage madness, characterized by withdrawal from human contact, repetitive behaviors, and an inability to function in social situations. Modern analysis suggests these were symptoms of complex trauma resulting from decades of abuse, disguised as marital duty. But even death couldn't destroy all the evidence. What medieval authorities left behind would shock modern historians into recognizing the greatest systematic abuse in European history. The Great Cover-Up, the concealment of medieval marriage horrors, began with Renaissance humanists who couldn't reconcile their idealized vision of chivalry with the documented reality of spousal abuse. When 15th and 16th century scholars encountered evidence of legalized domestic violence and child marriage, they faced a crisis that shaped historical scholarship for centuries. Giovanni Boccaccio set the pattern, writing extensively about medieval culture while omitting its darkest marital customs. His sanitized versions emphasized courtly love, ignoring the legal frameworks granting husbands absolute power over wives' bodies and lives. This whitewashing continued through the Enlightenment. Scholars like Edward Gibbon privately collected medieval legal documents detailing spousal murder and child marriage, but excluded them from published work. As universities formalized historical studies, records of abusive marriage customs were locked away in restricted archives. Institutional erasure. The Catholic Church actively destroyed or reclassified marriage records, contradicting later theology. After the Council of Trent, 16th century, thousands of documents detailing earlier abuses were burned or sealed in Vatican archives. Victorian historians took concealment faced with evidence of bedding ceremonies and legalized abuse. Scholars like William Stubbs used euphemisms to avoid offending sensibilities. Husbands' rights to beat or kill wives were framed as masculine authority, not systemic violence. Modern resistance. 20th century feminist researchers began uncovering suppressed evidence, but faced institutional pushback. Barbara Tuchman's groundbreaking work on medieval women was initially rejected by publishers who deemed it too disturbing. Even today, museums display edited marriage contracts, removing references to child brides and abuse. The British Museum keeps thousands of unaltered documents in restricted storage. Pop culture perpetuates myths of romantic medieval love, erasing the brutality that defined most unions. Why it matters. This centuries-long cover-up has distorted our understanding of women's historical experiences, the origins of marriage laws, how easily institutions normalize abuse when women are treated as property. Medieval Europe's marital system, where childhood was commodified, marriage was slavery, and domestic life was torture, echoes in modern societies that treat women as economic assets, fail to protect abuse victims, prioritize male authority over human dignity. A final thought. We live in an era of unprecedented marital freedom. Unlike medieval women, you can choose your spouse, own property, leave abusive relationships. These rights represent a radical break from history. If this glimpse into the past has left you hungry for more buried truths, don't miss the next chapter of history's erased horrors. Click the video on your screen now. And if you want to keep uncovering these forgotten stories together, hit subscribe. These voices deserve to be heard.